so this is what happens when socialists are in power. This is what happens, when you have a corrupt government, or when we don't have enough money for infrastructure. It was just, people couldn't just say this is a tragedy. They had to imbue it with a political dimension and motive. In the States, we had the Super Bowl a few weeks ago. And at the Super Bowl, no one talked about the day after who won the Super Bowl. Everyone talked about whether Taylor Swift was going to endorse Joe Biden. That was the commentary the next day. That and sports used to be an apolitical environment. It used to be that we could come around just beautiful things. These are just beautiful things, like living with them, and not. But instead, everything. Where we grocery shop, where we send our kids to school, where we get our news from, that where we choose to live, everything seems to have a political valence, a political dimension to it, in an unprecedented way, which is a symptom of this crisis of misplaced meaning. That again, we've externalized our identity in things that we can't control, and we're just walking on. We're just primed to be hurt and wounded and offended all the time, perpetually.
So you said just now, and you say in your book, that human nature hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. One of the arguments that Richard Dawkins, in his book on atheism, uses to explain the development of religion is that he thought people couldn't believe that bad things just happened. Mm-hmm. So if there was an earthquake or a flood or something, it must be down to human wickedness. And one sees the same thing with what you were just saying about Notre Dame. I remember that the day after the Grenfell tragedy here, every newspaper had somebody to blame. It was evil landlords, or immigrants, or EU rules, or eco rules, and it was always, guess what, it was always someone that they already didn't like. So an earlier generation would have blamed witches or religious minorities. Ours blames political opponents. Yes. Are we seeing something that's actually new, or is it just this sacralization of politics?
It's a great question and a great insight. This is kind of the same question about social media. Is it, are we seeing anything new in human nature, or just the worst excesses of human nature displayed, writ large for everyone to see? Now, 100 years ago, one person's vitriol only could reach people in earshot, right? Or I guess if you circulated in paper or something like that. But today, it's like one person's mistruth, one person's vitriol can reach millions instantaneously. Churchill said, "A lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on." That was 70 years ago, and this is all the more true now in the age of social media and Twitter and just this hyper connectivity. Like we're all connected in an unprecedented way. So it's the same core aspect of who we are, just kind of writ large.
Final question from me. Everybody here, except the ones who are very welcome and who have arrived with you, Lexi, everyone here is a legislator. Everyone here is a member of one chamber or the other. What ought we to be doing? What would be your advice to people in public life if we wanted to re-civilize our political discourse?
It's a great idea. Lord Heracart famously said that democracy depends with constant dining with the opposition. Yeah. That democracy depends on civic friendship. It depends on proximity, having a basic affection and esteem for the people that you may vehemently disagree with and debate, on the floor and even in the public forum. And that is fragile. That is beautiful, essential, but also fragile. Those bonds of civic friendship. And I'll tell you a story that illustrates this. In America, in the late 1990s, it was a kind of a general consensus that incivility had reached a fever pitch. It was at an all-time low, and something had to be done. Congress had never been so polarized and rude and disrespectful and uncivil and dysfunctional. And an unprecedented amount of philanthropic effort and political will was harnessed to do something about it. The Aspen Institute and the Pew Charitable Trust, they put almost $1 million towards having a series of what they called Civility summits. And they invited all of Congress to bring their families as well to a little camp in Hershey, Pennsylvania, to half the time talk about the institutional challenges to civility and peaceful coexistence and doing their job, and the other half just to have unstructured free time and just to play and to relax and to eat and dine together, as Lord Heracart said. And it was remarkably successful. After this 4-day bipartisan civility summit, Over half of Congress went, many of them with their families, with their wives and children. Everyone who went came back and said this was a resounding success. We need to do this every year. You know, people were recontextualized once again. There had been this trend in recent decades, or recent years, to move people, for congresspersons not to move their family members to DC. That had been the norm for a long time, that people relocate, literally uproot, relocate, and then you're doing life together, literally with the people that you're debating by day. You're doing dinner and you're sending your kids to school together by night. But there was a trend that, you know, you have to be locally rooted, you know, that's not representing your constituency well, so don't move your family. So members would commute, they'd show up to debate, you know, pass laws, and then go home on the weekend, right? But that did take a toll on that social capital, that civic friendship, because they didn't know each other anymore. So, you know, getting people's families together, they were recontextualized, not just as that evil Republican or that godless Democrat, but like, you know, they're a father, they're a husband, they're a wife, you know, they're seeing them in the fullness of who they are. And it just rehumanized US Congress in a really beautiful, really powerful way. Tip O'Neill was the opposition, Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House, and they agreed. They said, this is incredible, we have to do this every year. And it seemed like there was hope in America for civility. And then guess what happened? The Monica Lewinsky scandal. And then all bets are off. This was all of a sudden an opportunity to impeach, you know, embarrass and impeach the other side. And that was just, you know, exploited to the nines. There was the impeachment trial. It was disastrous. But it just, you know, what I love about that story is that, you know, civic friendship that makes a democracy function both at the level of individual citizens, not non-politicians, but also especially at the level of our politicians. It's indispensable. It's fragile. It can be regained. You know, that's a lesson. Just over the course of a few days, it can be regained. But it is also fragile. It is.
And I wonder sometimes whether politicians, like subatomic particles in quantum theory, their behavior is determined by whether they're being observed. So I think most people in this room would recognize that there is a lot more civility in the House of Lords than in the House of Commons, despite a lot of the people having been in both. And it's simply because nobody is watching us in the House of Lords. I don't say that in this room everywhere. And so there's no grandstanding. There's no one to show off to. If you ask a question at our end, incredible that this would seem to any MP, it's to elicit information. And if you start saying, doesn't the minister know, and maybe I can help him, it's like, you just look a complete idiot. Whereas at the other end, I think it's the other way around. Which is my cue to invite one of our colleagues from the Commons. I'm going to ask everyone please to just say who they are, so the next knows who you are. Dan.
Thanks, Dan. So thanks so much. I mean, it'd be really good to listen to you. I mean, the key difference, of course, between the two.
And just say who you are.
Sorry, I'm Danny Kruger. I'm a member of the House of Commons. The main difference is that you guys aren't standing for re-election, and therefore you don't have to accentuate your differences to the public, which is the great value of our adversarial politics. And so I just want to question whether you do genuinely identify civility with an absence of polarisation. I actually think polarisation of our politics is helpful to the democratic process because it invites the public to make a choice. And the danger of an overly civil discourse in which the politicians of the different parties are being all very nice to each other and agreeing is that they get into a little huddle of consensus which actually excludes the public. So I think there is something to be said for an adversarial politics, and our chambers here, unlike in the US, are designed, and inadvertently, because it's the House of Commons chamber used to be a college chapel, which is why the seats face each other, rather than say it's face the front in an old-fashioned church, or in a parish church. So we happen to have a format that facilitates an adversarial conversation. But obviously you have that in any democratic process, any democratic chamber. So the other thing I was thinking of when you're talking is Boris Johnson got in a lot of trouble during the Brexit rows when he was Prime Minister for using very militaristic language about the fact that we were in. And the other side got very irate when he used to talk about the surrender bill, which was an attempt to overrule what the government was doing. And he talked about the battle and he used kind of military metaphors. And the other side and his opponents would say it's very inappropriate to use that kind of language because it sort of encourages actual physical violence, accusation. It's a dangerous thing to do. So as I always defended Boris because what he was doing was using the language that people use. And he was, as I say, he was engaging the public in our political debate in a meaningful way. So would you just tell us whether you think it's appropriate sometimes to have a bloody great argument in public, to use quite aggressive, even offensive language about the other side, because that's actually good for democracy and it might actually be the best thing for all of us.
I think it's a great point, and I think it's worth noting that not all polarization is equal. And that in the research on polarization, there are two types of polarization. One is where you think that you disagree with the other side, and you're willing to accentuate the differences. The other is where you hate the other side so much you're willing to do anything in order to beat them and like destroy them. Like, I think that's called affective polarization. And so I think that applies not just in the realm of public discourse, but also in how citizens think of each other. That and how politicians debate issues of the day, where you're not going after people's. I mean, sure, go after their character if there's something to go after there, but not impugning it unnecessarily, not digging up dirt and mudslinging just for its own sake, but just having those boundaries of decency that don't bring all of public discourse and all politicians down, and that unnecessary mudslinging. But I think that the parameters of civility are really helpful, are a helpful framework to answer your question about what's appropriate and when. That it's respectful to have robust disagreements, to say, you've done this and I disagree with it, and like these are the consequences of what you're proposing, and that is the beauty, and again, the lifeblood of the democratic process. But civility at the same time also takes certain conduct off the table. It respects people enough to tell hard truths, to confront them, to speak. It respects yourself. It demands respecting yourself if you have something to say, and not just keeping silent out of fear of being silenced or shamed or canceled. That you sometimes we owe it to ourselves to speak up to others and to speak truth to power, or even just to have these robust conversations in public life, but also in our personal lives as well, where it can sometimes feel easier to not have uncomfortable conversations, to kind of kick it down the can. Canada, we're great at that. I wrote an article for the Globe and Mail in Canada about how Canadians are too often settle for politeness. We kind of avoid the uncomfortable conversations, and we don't often aim for civility, which is again what democracy requires. I'm happy to share that with you in case you're interested in.
And look at Canada.
Yeah. So, but civility, demands that we have these conversations, and demands that there are parameters in place that, we do it in a way that is respectful, a way that is, inclined to be heard, and not beating people over the head, not demeaning them, not undermining their personhood and dignity. That is the parameters that civility offers. So, thank you.
Baroness Fox, again, just in one sentence, tell the world who you are and what you do before launching into the question.
I'm not very polite or civil, so I run the Academy of Ideas, and indeed I've been in touch with Lexi, and I'm delighted that she's going to come and speak to some young people, and that may be around a project we run called Living Freedom, and it actually relates to what I'm talking about, or what I want to ask you about, which is a little bit like Danny just said. I often hear people call for, take it down a notch and so on, and don't argue, from people who actually do not want me to say, as it were, or any of us to speak truth to power. And particularly young people, it's a phenomenon which they'll say, we don't want this kind of feeling of discomfort. I find that offensive, and and anybody who asserts authority, for example, with the young can be accused of bullying, not just with the young, but this goes on. So I suppose it's just getting the balance right, because I'm sure that I know it's not what you're arguing, but there is a danger of kind of arguments for let's all get on and go away on civility summits. That basically what you're trying to do is to take the sting out of politics in a way that I don't think would be helpful. That's one thing. So what do you think of that, although it's sort of similar to what Danny said? The second thing though is, we're in the middle of a big argument in the UK, and it's obviously happening in the US, but maybe in the UK we're slightly more, the argument's gone further in a positive sense, which is Dr. Hilary Cass has just brought out a review explaining and the points about why medical intervention into young people in terms of sex and gender, the idea of changing those sex is not possible. I'm not going to rehearse the whole thing. The reason I'm using that as an example is because she made a point about the toxicity of the debate. And one of the things that made me nervous, she's right, of course, it's very toxic. You can lose your job and reputation and so on, and all of us in what that's like. To be embroiled in that, because you can be accused of being a bigot. The problem, though, is it makes it sound as though there's toxicity on all sides, and what we've got to all do is be less toxic. You think, no, actually, I want to have the debate with the other side. I want to be able to have I mean, in other words, it's a bit one-sided. So I just wonder when you were saying, you know, and is ever thus, and it's part of the human condition. I do think there's something that's happened at the moment, which is just that one side of an argument is often demonised, and anyone who tries to argue back, then arguments around civility can be weaponised to make it look as though you're being toxic, whereas actually you're trying to just have the argument out. And you know, whether it's Israel, Gaza, sex or gender, let's be honest, I think that one side is the bully, but they often do it in the name of being calm and nice. And those of us who try and argue back are considered the monsters who are uncivil, but actually we're the good guys really, because we're right. By the way, yeah.
Well, I think that particular issue is a prime example of what we were talking about a little while ago about misplaced meaning and identity. How can you, where's there like debate? This is who I am, it's my identity, you know? Like that I think that is a prime issue of, you know, people going 0 to 60 and non-rational, non-reasonable conversations being had. And I think a core part of that is the lack of, you know, basic affection and basic trust, basic civic friendship that kind of pervades our culture right now. It's so easy to be vilified and demonized, like on both sides. You know that there's no assumption of grace. There's no benefit of the doubt given. There's no hermeneutic of charity. Interpret a person's question, you know, with a charitable assumption. And we just assume it's an attack and an assault on who we are, and that's how people respond, and why they want to shut it down. It's like, so I think that is a prime example of that. To your question about the misuse and abuses of the language of politeness, I want to tell a story of a hero of civility that I celebrate in my book, one who has transatlantic significance, the story of William Penn and the Quakers, who are heroes of civility in my book. So William Penn, he was the aristocratic, you know, very privileged child of Admiral Penn, who was very well connected and had high hopes for his son to be very well, you know, affluent, well connected in his own right. Sent him to Oxford, you know, had all the right education, all the right events, all the right, you know, training. And then this is how the story is told in Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie, okay, about in the entry on the Quakers. So William Penn comes home from Oxford one day, and the admiral thought that Penn had lost his mind because he refused to, I think it was tip his hat to his father or do some sort of graciousness. And then the admiral realized that his son had just become a Quaker instead. And of course, in his exposure and you know, spiritual journey of becoming a Quaker, he had been really persuaded of the absolute equality of all persons and the absolute moral abhorrence of any norms or propriety that inflated other people's ego, that flattered them. And so the Quakers were famous, infamous, despised, you know, put in jail for flouting norms and proprieties of the day, politenesses of the day, such as tipping hats, such as bowing, things like that. And we don't have it anymore, but you know, in English we used to have a formal and informal address, a two-vous distinction in the French. You know, one for our superiors and distant you know, peers, and then something for younger people and informal intimates. And that was thou was the informal one, and you was the formal one. Which one is it? That's right, yeah. And so the Quakers went around calling everyone thou. Everyone was called the informal one, and it bothered everyone. They were like just deeply, everyone was deeply offended. And you know, there was a story one time when William Penn was at a reception with the king. And the king entered the room, kind of a grand room like we were just in a few moments ago, and everyone bowed and kneeled, except for William Penn. And the admiral was mortified. What was going to be beheaded? How was the king going to respond? And the king kind of took it in stride, and he instead bowed to William Penn instead. But I love the story of the Quakers, because they realized that by complying with these social norms and proprieties, these niceties of the day, that they were in fact lying to people. They thought that they were inflating their pride in a way that was actually really harmful for them. It was saying, it was lying to them by saying you're better than me, when that's not the case. All are equal before God. And so they were vilifying for not being very polite, but I elevate them as heroes of civility. There's one more quick story about this. One time, to civilize him, the admiral sent William Penn to be in the court of Louis XIV in Paris, at Versailles. And one day, he was taking a break at Versailles, and he was roaming the streets of Paris one night. And he passed a Frenchman who then turned around and challenged him to a duel. And Penn was totally taken aback. What's going on? And apparently, Penn had passed him by and insufficiently acknowledged him with the sufficient deference that this gentleman thought he deserved. He didn't tip his hat or acknowledge him in whatever way, and wanted to literally kill William Penn as a result. And Penn writes about this in his memoir, his spiritual autobiography called No Cross, No Crown. And he said, that was a moment where I was so convicted about the perils of politeness, of false displays of propriety that inflate people up, where this guy was literally willing to kill a life because his pride had been wounded. And that's why he folds it into his argument for why those kinds of proprieties are not essential, and we should instead focus on true civility and equality, treating people equally, even if it offends them instead.
Yes. I'm afraid I would put Charles II, who was the king who doffed his hat to Penn, in the category of somebody who was incredibly charming and had a thoroughly bad influence on public life. I'm going to come to our foremost historian, Lord Robertson, over in a second, but I wonder if I could just pick up on one thing that Baroness Fox said. The other guys are the baddies. Jonathan Haidt argues very strongly that everyone is programmed to think that. We're all designed by evolution to exaggerate any wrong done to us and to downplay any wrong done by our side. So just as an intellectual exercise, let's think of some of the things where the other side has been unforgiving. Diane Abbott saying Jews can't suffer from racism. Rupa Hug saying quasi-plotting doesn't sound black. Gary Lineker saying Suella Braverman is like 1930s Germany. Did we show forgiveness? I don't think we did. I didn't see much civility. I didn't hear many prominent conservatives saying, look, they express that badly, but it's better to live in a world where there are second chances. And the reason I mention that is simply that there's always this temptation to say, and it may be true, as Claire did, look, if we do that, it won't be reciprocated. But is that an argument to not do it?
It's also, can I just point out that in this room, that I am not in the we, but we all managed to get on, and there's a few of us where we definitely wouldn't be in the we, but we've coped. In other words, what my argument is that there's something very specific about politics today. It's not just the human condition. I disagree with Hannan on this, by the way.
But the examples you cited just then, if you say, you make a mistake, deserve another chance, you're weak.
Well, that's the dilemma. But then
it's a Prime Minister's questions. You've performed. You see it.
Right.
If either side were to be civil and say, oh, that's a very good point you raise. Now I'd like to have a cup of tea with you afterwards and talk about that in more depth. We don't have time to do that. I think we lost the plot. We're programmed to.
Okay, we've got another 20 minutes, half an hour or so. I've got Lord Roberts and Baroness Meyer. Is there anybody else who'd like to come in? And just introduce yourself in a sentence.
Yes, Andrew Roberts, I'm a historian, and I'd like to just ask about was it disorder of loves that you mentioned? Because where people put their political views before their deep love of one another, because you've described perfectly my wife's attitude to Brexit, or at least to me during Brexit. We did manage to have an agreement just not to listen to the Today programme, or at least we listened to the Today programme, but we didn't say anything immediately afterwards when I was cleaning my teeth. And that worked extremely well. Because, not largely because she didn't turn into a bit of a Remainer, otherwise obviously it would have been a very difficult long term. But can I put forward the idea with regard to the Civility, what did you call it, Civility Summit idea, of, you mentioned Winston Churchill, what he did was to set up a club called the Other Club, deliberately in 1911 because the hostility was getting so bad between the Liberal Party and the Conservatives, to meet once a month, which still meets, I'm a member, it still meets today. And one of the rules of that club was that nothing shall interfere with the rancour and disparity of party politics. So what they actually did was to get together friends and then have arguments about politics, which again still happens to this day. But because you're sitting next to them, because you can't really get up and march out, because you know you're going to meet them next month as well, because they very often are friends, then actually, because of the way in which the situation works, where you are all members of the same club in the first place, you can have the rows, but they're always done on a very gentlemanly and ladylike fashion. So I'm going to put forward that as an idea.
I love that example. I mean, it's basically keeping the wellspring, keeping the civic bonds fresh and refreshed at the wellspring of just time together and community in a ritualized, sort of formalized way. I think that's extraordinary and beautiful. So, is it a proposal? Was it a question or just a comment?
It was a statement posing as a question.
Like all of them.
Yes, I love that. So I want to hear more from you about the club and membership and is it invitational?
Well, no, yes. Actually, the membership, the executive committee is again quoting from Churchill, wrapped in impenetrable mystery. But it's actually Nicholas Soames, Churchill's grandson, who decided who's a member. The key point I suppose I was making was that yes, you're brought together in a social environment, but nobody's expected not to push their political views to the max. You know, it's just nobody shouts and nobody leaves.
Yes, because they're hamstringed by basic respect for the other. Like, you like each other too much. Like, I mean, democracy depends on not taking the marbles and going home when you don't get your way, right?
Exactly.
And when you have a basic, comity, a camaraderie with these are your friends. You go to war a day and you disagree a day and then drink together at night. And that's beautiful. And again, that's the insight that Lord Heracart was
The drinking thing is pretty essential.
I'd say so. And I mean, I remember, I think the gentleman who just left asked a question about the language of war, whether that's appropriate in the political mouths. I mean, Clausewitz famously said that politics is war by their means. And Claire, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. I feel so impolite and uncivil, but
no,
I was glad to be here at all.
See you in a few days. But the inverse is also true. We often like that war is politics by their means. And as our deliberative discourse breaks down, our institutions break down, our commitment to what Lord Moulton called the obedience to the unenforceable, as that breaks down, like our self-governance and voluntary restraint, then violence becomes an option. A viable option once again comes back on the table. And so I just think that bye, thank you.
Thanks for coming. Now that you're different.
Interesting conversation.
Thank you. The club is an essential part of that. It's voluntarily, staying committed to this joint project of self-governance. It is a democracy, and that requires us voluntarily, staying present. No one's forcing us to be here, but I think venues like what you're talking about cause us to want to be here and not to want to just give up and call it a day on life with others and democracy. Thank you, Andrew. Such a privilege.
Lady Maya.
My name is Catherine Mayer, and I'm in the House of Lords, a Conservative member. I just want to ask, don't you think it all starts at the beginning? Because human nature is, animals, and it's actually the environment that makes us behave in certain ways. So therefore, education is at the root of it. And these days, obviously, people are not brought up to be civil and polite. But the one thing I would disagree with you is your concept of politeness. I mean, I was brought up to be polite. And the politeness, and you put the example of, in France, you have the vous and the tu. I think having a vous and a tu is actually fantastic, because you can't start saying, vous êtes des imbéciles. It doesn't work.
You can though.
That's
Listen to one of their parliamentary debates.
that's in the plural. That's in the plural.
Yeah.
But you know, to insult somebody when you use the word vous immediately creates a bit of a distance. And I find politeness is actually really important. And politeness that does not need to be hypocritical. Mm-hmm. You can be polite and tell your friends, I'm sorry, you know, this is not right. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, just you were talking in America, how you know, this civility movement that you were talking about, here we had something which I think a lot of people in this room were as stunned as I was. We were forced, all of us, to go on a course of value everybody. And this course had nothing to do with actually being polite with somebody, or, as you were saying, being civil to somebody. It was just all about race, about sex, about bullying, to the point that when I arrived in the House of Lords, I remember the first week or somebody was going to come into a lift with me, and the man said, oh, I better not come in the lift with you, because he was afraid that we would only be the two of us in the lift, and I could have accused him of, you know, whatever, not behaving properly. So I think that's...
Who was it? Would you?
I'm
ready to be welcomed if you had.
There we are.
But what I'm trying to say is that, don't you think that the big tragedy is, you know, human beings have not evolved, and if you allow people to behave badly, they will behave badly. But that if you teach a child to be polite, that is the road to civility. Because by being polite...
Can I add a twist to it? Because people would say that we're still educating children. But the difference, maybe, to tell me if this is nonsense, Catherine, is I don't think previous generations were so keen on encouraging children to find their true selves and to be focused on what they really want all the time. And the message, not just of our education, but of every Hollywood film that is aimed at young people, is, you know, be true to yourself, which actually is quite a difficult principle to reconcile with any kind of orderly society at all. But maybe I'm missing something. But sorry if I'm...
Because now the culture is me first, and other people later. As when, you know, my generation, I was brought up in a Catholic school, but I'm not religious, and the whole education was absolutely the opposite. You know, it was others first and you second. But even the way men and women behave these days, when I was young, a man could open the door for me. Now it's called sexism. I don't see it sexism. I quite like men to open the door for me, but that's not the point. The point is that any signs of civility now is either criticized or it's sort of, well, do you think I can't open my own door? I mean, I heard that. Yes. And so I think we've lost the plot in putting ourselves, the individual, as number one.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. I love the question. It's about the relationship between civility and politeness. And again, politeness is like the external form, and civility is the internal disposition.
But one needs to the other.
And at its best, and it's a good point about especially with children, you know, training them in traditional pedagogy, it was, you know, orthodoxy and orthopraxy, right? Right belief informs right action, and as Aristotle reminds us, right action can enhance right belief, right? And this is you know, why traditional educational models led by example, by instruction, and repetition, and in these two forms, to have both work together, right? Internal belief and external action working in tandem. And at its best, that is the case. That the form of politeness, the external stuff, can corroborate and reinforce the orthodox, the right belief about actually respecting others. At its worst, though, without the right belief, without civility, politeness can just be empty gestures, or it can be manipulative and a tool of undermining and deception. Yes, go ahead.
Don't you think, probably I didn't express myself,
Yes.
don't you think that politeness is the first step? That if you are taught to be polite, then the next step is also to understand civility.
It's a great
Because
question.
civility is not an instinct of a human origin.
It's a great
They will
question.
fight with the same toy.
Right. I talk about this in my chapter on education, where I encourage parents and teachers to think about, how to educate in not just politeness alone, but also in civility, not just being content with kids who do the right thing, but having them be good people as well. And I have a very, Augustinian approach to education and to life in general. And St. Augustine is really important to my theory of civility and human nature for many reasons. One is, he has this concept. I argue that this is a timeless problem, not just a now problem, not just a problem of the UK or democracy, because we are defined as human beings by two competing forces: love of others and love of self. We become fully human in relationship and in community with others. We are doggedly social at all times and all places. As long as we've been around as a species, we've tried to do this thing called life together with others, and it has always been hard. It has never been a foregone conclusion. Why? Because we're also defined by self-love, morally and biologically. St. Augustine, in his work City of God, he called it the incurvatus in se, the inward curve upon the self that is an indelible part of who we are, of the human condition. He said an expression of that incurvatus in se is the libido dominante, the lust to dominate. And this is wordplay in the original Latin. The lust to dominate becomes the dominating lust. The more that we exercise our lust to dominate others, to exert power over them, to put ourselves before others, the more that action forms our character, and that becomes the lust that dominates us. This is Augustine's, ecology of the soul, the human spirit that I borrow throughout my book. And so the project, this is important and essential to the educational project, because the educational project at its core is about creating good humans. It's about ordering our passions, ordering our loves, and training us through right belief and right practice to consider the needs and well-being of others alongside ourselves. Exactly what you were just saying. And exactly as you said, this is not natural. This is not a foregone conclusion. I'm a mother of two young kids. My Percival James is 4, and my Sophia Margot is 2. And every day I have to train them, and ideally I hope I model for them what it means to serve, what it means to consider the needs of others alongside, because it is not natural to my toddlers to serve their siblings, to serve their parents, and that is my duty. I'm a custodian of their soul craft as a parent, and when I send them to school, like the people I send them to school, I want them to be custodians of their soulish ordering and cultivation as well. This is the Latin word for our word education comes from the Latin educare, which means to lead forth or to bring out. And that's what education ought to do, to bring forth that which is best in us, to unlock our human potential and diminish that which is worst in us. And each of it, and this is, again, why I think it's important to recognize the timelessness of this problem, because it's so easy to want to externalize and blame one person, one epiphenomenon, one technology, what Elon Musk is doing with the algorithm, one crisis, but one party, this emerges from a part of the human personality that we all share, and is part of the human condition that we all share, and we all would love to talk about solutions, what we can do about it, because we do have each have a role to play in the solution as well.
I'm fascinated by the capacity for rudeness in languages that have a familiar form. There's another anniversary today as well as the tragedy of Notre Dame. 42 years ago today, an Argentine Air Force pilot, whose name was Caffaretti, was ordered to open fire on a hospital ship,
Wow.
SS Uganda. And he said, "You've made a mistake, I can see red crosses on it." And the commanding officer said, you have your orders, engage as instructed. And he said in very polite, formal, said Spanish, ¿por qué no se vaya un poco a la mierda, mi general? Which is a very, very rude thing, but in very polite, and it would be an utterly forgettable statement had he not vouvoyé, if you like. And I think it's a neat illustration of how you can observe.
Can you translate it? Basically?
It's sort of roughly, why don't you go to hell, Colonel? Right, one last intervention from Lord Elliot.
Great to meet you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming, Catherine.
Thank you. Nextly, good to see you. Matthew Elliott, a veteran of the Brexit wars or discussions or what have you, and I can really echo the point was made about the difference between polite and civilised discussion and just name calling, which not happened too much in that debate. Updating it to the present day and what's going on this year with the US elections. I'd be fascinated with your thoughts on the two main candidates, Trump versus Biden. How do they rank in politeness and civility? And it strikes me, if you look back at the last election, Trump wasn't particularly polite, but there were certain times when he was and has been proved right. So when he talked about NATO spending, he was called out for having said that the Europeans should be spending more, and it was the wrong thing to say. He shouldn't be saying that, or disrespecting other countries, and yet it's been proved right on that. And conversely, on the Democrat side, often sort of would say they're more polite, but then behind the scenes would go against their opponents using the full power of the state against them. So some reflections on the elections, yeah.
Right. Well, I think, Donald Trump is a really interesting case study in this. Like, his popularity enduring popularity is explained largely because of people intuiting that this essential difference that I argue for, the difference between civility and politeness. He positioned himself as this strong man, this bully who is unafraid to speak truth to power to your enemies. Like, I'm going to say the things that you wish you could say, and I'm going to say them with impunity, and I'm going to do it on your behalf. And it's the appeal of that. Like he is saying things that are on other people's mind, right? They're secretly voting for him, not publicly. I mean, many are people, but they are people. This is why in the 2016 election, the world was surprised. I was surprised that he was elected. Because people did not divulge to pollsters or even their neighbors that they voted for him, but they're like, he's saying things that resonate with me, and he's saying the things that he's standing up to the people that I wish I was brave enough to stand up to. So people are, by and large, dissatisfied with the culture of politeness and tone policing. We don't talk about that. I'm going to silence you from saying that. And he's puncturing that hypocrisy in a really powerful and evocative way. I do not by any means condone Donald Trump's and his excesses, his vulgarity, not at all. But I do think that the arguments in my book explain the Trump phenomenon that still continues to puzzle many people. It's like people are discontented with faux, respect and niceness, and they're like, no, like I have thoughts and I have opinions that I'm afraid to talk about, but I'm glad someone's doing it. I don't agree with everything. Of course I don't agree with, I disagree. He's made mistakes. He's done things I disagree with, but by and large, he's doing things and saying the things I wish I could. And that I think is a really interesting phenomenon. And now, unfortunately, the argument can very easily be made that the Overton window is shifted because of him and people who are responding to him, right? They're that he's taken it here and the other side wants to take it down here, and it's just like becomes a race to the bottom. And what can be done then? And I think that's a really interesting question to me. It's one reason why I fled government. Part of why and how I came to write this book. I was in the belly of the beast, and I do think that my experience in government was kind of a microcosm of the divisions and excesses in our world and the States as a whole. And I came home from work one day and said to my husband, I am done with Washington, I'm done with toxic politics, let's move to Indiana. That was my decision to leave government, leave DC, and move to the Midwest. I felt utterly feckless. I felt utterly useless. Like it felt intractable, and nothing could be done. And I focused on writing this book, and we built a community, raised our family while doing that. But one of my first friends when I was in Indiana. Her name was Joanna Taft. She came up to me after church one day in Indianapolis and said, "Hi, I'm Joanna. Would you like to porch with us sometime?" And I never heard the word porch used as a verb before, but I was curious. And so we went to her home that afternoon, and I realized that my new friend Joanna was staging a quiet revolution against the division, against the toxicity, against the antagonism and alienation that defines our status quo right now. She had curated people across geography, across politics, across race, not to have a structured conversation across difference, but just to inhabit a shared space. She had created on her porch that day a sort of oasis for the division, and it was a chance for people to be seen and known and loved in the fullness of their humanity, the fullness of who they were. And we talked about, inherently non-political things like the weather and schools and plays going on. And I realized this is like sort of what was revolutionary about what she was doing is that she was saying, I can't control who's running for president or who wins the presidency or what the scandal of the day or what crisis and tragedy is going on across the world, but I can control myself. And I'm going to choose to make my vicinity, reclaim my sphere of influence and make that better and more beautiful. And there's great power in that. And that very much tracks kind of my experience of fleeing the intractability of government and saying, I single-handedly can't reform bureaucracy and elevate civility in our world, but I can write a book, that I hope makes the world a more gentle place for my children to one day grow up in. And in chapter 5, I unpack, this metaphor of the porch, that it really is just a metaphor. It's not about the porch itself, it's about a lifestyle. It's about choosing to be a part of the solution in our everyday, to elevate our everyday junctures, to become what Pope Francis called artisans of the common good, and to choose to make outsiders insiders, to make people feel seen and known and loved, and to have our lives and our homes and be an oasis for the division, and to build these friendships across these divides. That's really, I think, that is the theory of social change I promulgate in the book. I don't make arguments for institutional reforms, and that's not my area of expertise or my area of interest. Like I just came away utterly, disaffected by institutions, and I've met people and I've worked alongside people across the country, across the states like Joanna, who are doing similar things. They're saying, I'm just going to focus on making my little sphere of influence better and more beautiful, and that is their response to the division. There's great power in that. That is the beauty of a democracy, that the citizen is prior to the state, to the regime, and even the elected officials, that every single individual citizen has way more power to either be a part of the problem in how they live their lives and how they use social media, these newfound tools at our disposal, or they have way more power than they think to be a part of the solution as well. And so my theory of social change is inherently individual and organic and bottom up. It says it in the subtitle of my book, The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves, that in healing ourselves and elevating how we live our lives every day, that we can make the world a little bit of a brighter and more gentle place, I hope.
I'm going to ask you one, thank you for that answer, Lexi. I'm going to ask you one final question which follows on from Matthew's about US politics. I mean, the polarization didn't begin with Trump.
Right.
There's been, in a lot of Western democracies, this tendency to demonize the other side, measured in lots of quantifiable ways. The most striking for me being when Republicans and Democrats are asked, what do you think of the other side? From they're my friends to I hate them. Around about 2005, the I hate them began to creep above 50%, which is a quite extraordinary fact if you think about it. So this was happening, but instead of, we could look at, is it caused by social media, was it to do with the global financial crisis, but one interesting way of looking at it, and I think you're uniquely well placed to answer this, is where has that not happened, and what can we learn about the counterexamples? What light does that shed? Now, one place where it seems to me really not to have happened is Canada. The last two Canadian elections, I was in Vancouver, and those of you who have not observed a Canadian election at first hand, it is a quite extraordinary exercise in unbelievable levels of politeness. And no one in Canada ever believes this. They always say, oh no, it's worse than it's ever been. But actually, judged against any other yardstick, a hustings meeting in Canada is, you know, oh, I'm so sorry, I thought you finished, please carry on. Oh, did I misunderstand you? Sorry, explain your mind. It's something utterly outside the rest of the Anglosphere's kind of understanding. Now, I wonder why you think that is. Stephen Harper always says, it's always been that way. This is why we became Canadians. It was the people who had enough of division and bloodshed who came here in the first place and established the kind of hegemonic culture. I don't know, but even when I listen to my angriest Canadian friends, no one actually really thinks that if the other side wins an election, there won't be any more elections. Whereas that's really quite a widespread sentiment that you hear all the time in the US now. How do we explain the difference?
So I think that you and I, Dan, might have a different subsection of Canadian friends, because I do know some Canadian friends. So I do know a contingent of people that, you know, I think that the same symptoms and the same problems have manifested, and maybe to a lesser extent, just because I think it is a more temperate climate, a more moderate kind of this ethos, and people are just, you know, generally contented. And I grew up in Canada. I love Canada. It's always just a very calming and tranquil place. But I do think the divisions are there, as they are in most Western democracies right now. And I think that, I don't know, maybe the psyche of Canadians is also kind of unique. They're really good at, they have sort of a negative identity, right? They know who they are contra America, you know, but in context to America, they know they're not American. And so they get really jazzed, really, you know, animated about American and Canadian relations. But I just think that it's such a high quality of life generally. People are very content in Canada. That I don't know. Are there other places besides Canada that come to mind, or was that just?
Well, I mean, I'm very interested in using this other end of the telescope. I would say that if you in Europe, the party system has broken down, and you have anti-systemic populist parties outside the old ones. So they can be on the left, or they can be on the right of the sort of AFD kind. But their whole shtick is, we hate the whole system, we hate the other side.
Right.
Now, in the US, because of the primary system, that has been anchored within the parties, but you see the same shift both to sort of Bernie Sandersism and to Trumpism. I say that, and in this country it's happening as well to a degree. I say that the places where it outstandingly hasn't happened so much, and where the old traditional parties are still more or less recognisable in a way that they would have been in the early 90s, are Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And if I ask myself what's different about them, I come up with two answers, but these are just wild stabs in the dark, and I may be missing it. One, they came through the global financial crisis without a downturn. That was highly unusual, and so there wasn't this resentment about the bailouts, there wasn't this sense that the poor had been expropriated through the tax system in order to rescue some very rich bankers and bondholders from the consequences of their own mistakes. The other thing that all those countries have in common, and nowhere in Europe does, and the US doesn't, is that they have virtually zero illegal immigration, which means that it's possible to sustain a remarkable degree of consensus behind high levels of legal immigration, because people feel that they're in control. And I wonder whether, I was mentioning to your mother earlier that the most prominent Vancouverite academic in this country, no one in BC has heard of him. He's very famous here, it's a man called Eric Kaufman. He says that all of this populism is about demographic change. It's nothing really to do with, and he's run all sorts of very brilliant surveys. In fact, I think it was Lord Moynihan who introduced me to him in one of his earlier books. Maybe the incivility, he would argue, is to do with uncertainty, insecurity, fear of change.
And I think that's a great factor. I think those are great points that you identified as being possible explanations for why the temperature seems to be generally lower here. I think a third might be the decentralization of government. The federal government is comparatively much weaker in Canada than the American federal government. I think next to the Swiss canton system, it's the most decentralized in the world. And what's important about that is, you know, the more the less of a footprint and role that federal government, that it matters less what the federal government, of course it matters, but education, healthcare, all of that is at the local level, many other huge issues. In the States, that is not the case. In the States, we have a massive federal government, and it's increasingly growing, and our democratically elected body is incapable of doing its job. This tricameral system, the body that is due to reflect the people, Congress, they're incapacitated by hyper-partisanship. They're not doing their job. And what that's doing is putting pressure on the courts and the administrative agency, the executive branch, to make decisions that Congress should be making, which just feeds the partisanship, feeds the frustration and the vitriol and it feeds this partisanship issue because these non-democratically elected bureaucrats, the administrative branch, or courts, are making decisions that Congress should make. So I think that's a really interesting point as well.
Great. Well, Lexi, thank you very much for taking the time, and thank you, colleagues, for coming.
Thank you so much.
The Soul of Civility, Alexandra Hudson, available on Amazon or in all good bookshops, and I appreciate all of you all coming and giving up your time. Thank you.
Thank you.